Thank you so much to all of you for joining us today. My name is Natalie Wood. I'm Vice President of Policy and Research here at NCSL. I've worn many hats during my tenure at our organization, but all you really need to know for purposes of today, state legislatures, and a lover of all things legislative institution just like you. And I'm extremely honored to be your guide as we trip down memory lane together, along with the illustrious Carl Kurtz. You can clap, totally. Do it. We feed off of your good energy. Those of you who don't know Carl is a political scientist and a legislative expert who started working for our organization in 1975, just as we were getting founded. And he retired just before our 40th birthday in 2014. He's a specialist in legislative operations and management. He's an author, and he supported legislatures throughout the world. He also has great taste with respect to hiring because he signed the final paperwork that brought me on board at NCSL in 2000. Thank you. Aw, thank you. Something for which I'll be forever grateful. But enough about us. This is about traveling back in time. It's time to talk about our origin story. To start, I want you to close your eyes and think about what it was like 50 years ago. Bell bottoms were big, and so was disco. Rotary phones were the norm, and Microsoft was just being founded in April of 1975. Hit movies like Rocky and Carrie were in development, along with a groundbreaking documentary. It was called The First Branch of Government, From Grassroots to Law, and it's a movie that followed Minnesota Representative Tom Berg in his quest to pass a land use bill. But don't take it from me, take it from the movie. But I would love to show you. And I will in just 1 minute. Can someone please help me? This is perfect. Perfect. Oh, man. Oh, so I'd like to invite Tim Story, our CEO, has nothing else to do right now, to come up and help with the showing of the video. Of course, we have a tech expert here as well.
It's pushing it out. Do you have the, because this is just the house slide. Are we sure we're...
Lovely.
By the way, I was just thinking, if we're really going to get into the spirit of 1975, you guys all need to smoke.
Who has seen the video before? Did anybody see the movie when it first came out? Excellent. I see Natalie Castle, Gary, you saw it too. Excellent. Curl Shard, oh, that's interesting. The whole thing? We won't be watching the whole video today if I'm able to get it going. Thanks, Tim. I got it.
Let's do it. Your smokes out.
All right, here we go. Aww.
So, I think you need to hit play. Oh.
Clerk, close the roll. Being 56 ayes and 67 nays, amendments not adopted. Question now reoccurs on the Casserly amendment. Any further discussion on the Casserly amendment? Not all in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. Motion's adopted.
By voice vote, Tom Berg's amendment has passed. But as the session moves into the evening, other opposition amendments are introduced. Each is defeated. But Berg and his colleagues are losing momentum.
74 nays, the motion's not adopted. Stephen H. offers the following amendment. Clerk will report the amendment.
This amendment deals with the Office of Hearing Examiner.
At 6:30 p.m., Tex Sieben plays his last card, offering an amendment whose successful adoption would seriously weaken the land use bill.
At the present time, under the bill that is proposed by the author, the council hears its own appeals. It decides whether it made the right decision in the first instance. That's not fair.
I think we've rejected the nine-man board, and I think 9 times as many reasons to reject a one-man board. council should make the final decision. That's what they're supposed to do. I would hope that you would vote no on this amendment.
Talon, Hennepin, Mr. Knoll, wish the floor?
And I guess I agree with Representative Casserly that when you convert that into a one-man appeal, the arguments just increase. I think they make the case for voting against this amendment.
Saban?
Mr. Chairman, my seatmate made a good point. However, I didn't put that hearing examiner in the bill. Representative Casserly did just a half hour ago on the House floor. And if they're a proper party in Representative Casserly's eyes, I think their decision ought to be given some weight, and that ought to be binding.
It's important to recognize what's happening here, and that Representative Sieben is trying to put in a new procedure and give some new authority to hearing examiners that they don't have in any other agency. And I submit again that this one is even worse than Representative Sieben-M's amendment.
Any further discussion? Not clerk, take the roll on the Sieben amendment.
It has been 13 months, constituting 15 hearings, hundreds of miles of travel, 500 hours of research, all to be measured by this amendment.
Has everybody voted who wishes to vote?
I think it's going on.
Sure, it's going on.
Being 68 ayes, 58 nays, the motion is
The
adopted.
drama. So good. Poor Representative Berg. Well, that's the end of the bill. Or is
At
it?
10:30 p.m. on February 3rd, the day of his defeat on the floor, Tom Berg returned to his office and began again.
All right, Gary, what happened to the bill? Do you remember? Well, fans of the legislative process might know that bill's never really dead, right? There was a conference committee later in the session, and Representative Berg got his legislation finally passed through both chambers and signed by the governor. So as you saw, I heard John Heining laughing in the back, which is exactly what I wanted to happen when you heard the roll call being tallied. Legislatures look different in 1975. The average pay for a lawmaker was just shy of $20,000. Actually, adjusted for inflation, it's $113,000. So we haven't made lots of progress there. The average pay for members is quite smaller, quite less than that. Legislatures have been moving from biennial to annual sessions. So between 1960s and 1975, they had flip-flopped from 40 of them met biennially to only 10 meeting biennially by then. And legislative staffing saw a surge. So from 1968 to 74, estimates are that the size of legislative staff doubled. But Carl, you were there. What else was going on in legislatures at that time?
Thanks, Natalie, and great to see so many friends and family members here, and nice to see some people who weren't way back when, wanting to learn about the history of NCSL. I'm going to start with the legislative strengthening movement, which we generally date from about 1965 to 1980. You're not.
Gotcha. Whoop,
Oop,
go back. Oh,
sorry.
man. Here, Carl.
Here we go. Okay, thank you. So the legislative strengthening story begins with the one-person, one-vote decisions by the United States Supreme Court. Before that decision, there were instances in different parts of the country, as many as in the same House, districts could be 200 times larger in one district than they were in another. Or there were a lot of states where they just didn't ever do redistricting. This was a landmark decision, and it had a big impact because it meant that there were a whole bunch of new legislators. There was mid-decade redistricting after Reynolds versus Sims decision. And so it brought in a whole bunch of new people, younger members for the most part, and most importantly, members who weren't tied to the status quo, and it wasn't their power base, and they were open to doing things in different ways. And then in the mid-1960s, the Speaker of the California Assembly was Jesse Unruh, nicknamed Big Daddy. He was a very large person and of very large appetites. I once went to a dinner with him where he ordered a $350 bottle of wine. This was 1975. And he tasted it and sent it back and ordered a more expensive bottle of wine. So he, though, was responsible for transforming the California legislature from a very part-time system to a full-time legislature in the image of the Congress. That was his goal, to have a full-time legislature, large staff, a pay where you could have that as your only job and serve as a member. And he succeeded in doing that by putting a proposition on the ballot that was passed in California in 1966 that transformed that legislature. And Unruh's success at doing that made him a missionary, that he thought that everybody, every state should follow their lead. All the state legislatures should be like the Congress or like California. And so one of the things he did, in addition to traveling around the country proselytizing for this, was he created an organization called the Citizens Conference on State Legislatures. This was a private nonprofit that was heavily funded by the Ford Foundation, and Unruh had the clout with the Ford Foundation to get them to support it, and the Ford Foundation invested in the strengthening of state legislatures. And in 1971, I must have skipped.
Sometime governments.
It's not there, okay. So in 1971, the Citizens Conference on State Legislatures published a book called The Sometime Governments, and we used to have a slide in there, a picture of the cover of that. And this was a book that ranked every one of the 50 legislatures from 1 to 50 based on a scale that was called the FAIR scale. There were 5 elements to it: fairness, accountability, independence, informed, and representative. And there were all kinds of methodological problems with this. As a political scientist, they have the same variable was counted on 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 different scales. So if you scored high on one of those, then you got double, triple, quadruple counted. The political scientist Alan Rosenthal confronted the director of the Citizens Conference, Larry Margolis, who had been Unruh's chief of staff in California. Margolis admitted, yeah, there are methodological problems with it, but he said if you don't rank them, they won't pay attention. And pay attention they did. He was right. And it turned out that it wasn't a matter of people wanting to be like California. In fact, very few wanted to be like California. But what they cared about was they didn't want their neighboring state or a state that they otherwise considered to be a peer, they didn't want to rank lower than them. So the people who were 20 and with a neighboring state of 30 on the scale of 1 to 100 took action. And the sometime governments also had a detailed prescriptions at the back of the book for every one of the 50 states, about 3-4 pages for each state, on steps they needed to take to build the capacity of their legislature to become more independent and able to make decisions independently of governors and lobbyists. And that, of course, was the goal. So from 1965 to 1980, virtually every state took major steps to enhance their staff resources, they increased the time they spent in session, and they raised their pay. Now, at the same time that this was going on, there were changes going on in the federal system. The Nixon administration had what was called the New Federalism. And the best example of that was the enactment of general revenue sharing in 1972, which was general revenue sharing was no strings attached money that went to state and local governments from the federal government. It was counter-cyclical and was designed to help turn things back to the states. And that was one where the state legislatures had a significant influence in Washington on that piece of legislation. The original bill in Congress called for the money that went to the states to be under the governor's control. And that mobilized people in state legislatures, and they went out and lobbied hard and ended up with where it ought to be, which was that money received under general revenue sharing would go through the legislative processes the same manner as all our other state revenues. So that was a triumph of one of the national organizations that preceded NCSL, the National Legislative Conference. And there were 3 competing organizations, and those organizations about 1970 started talking about a merger.
Thanks, Carl. Can you talk to us a little bit about those 3 organizations? Who were they? Who comprised those organizations?
Sure. So the oldest of them was the National Legislative Conference, founded in 1948. It was originally a legislative staff organization. It was an integral part of the Council of State Governments. And gradually in the 1950s, state legislators saw a good thing and said, oh, we want to participate in that as well. And by the late 60s and the early 70s, there was a very effective collaboration between legislators and legislative staff. And I'm going to share this with each one of these groups for the baseball fans out there who are used to having slash lines for rating baseball batting skills. I have my own slash line here. The first one in it is the size of the staff for the organization. The second one, 1,700 in this instance, was annual meeting attendance, and the third was budget of about $400,000. The second organization was the National Conference of State Legislative Leaders, which was founded in 1959 with the obvious focus on services to House and Senate presiding officers and majority and minority leaders. They had a very small staff, small annual meetings, and about $180,000 annual budget. And then the third organization was the National Society of State Legislators, which was founded in the 1960s after the leaders started up, and non-leader legislators said, well, we need our own organization and we don't want to be part of the NLC staff-driven group. And their focus was on training, information services, and high ethical standards. A noteworthy thing about them was that they had a partnership with a private sector, the Public Affairs Council, which eventually, I'm not really going to talk about this, but it became the State Government Affairs Council that we're familiar with today. And they were the smallest of the organizations in everything, staff, meeting attendance, and budget. So.
Thanks. I mean, anytime you get a group of folks together who like to deliberate, I'm sure there's lots of discussion, lots of sticking points. You have three groups of organization, or three orgs who like to deliberate. So talk to us about the sticking points as we approached a merger. What kinds of things were big topics of conversation?
Yeah, I'm going to focus on 4 of them and try to do them pretty quickly. The number one, the most obvious one, was each one of these groups had a slightly different primary constituency, and they all wanted to protect that. The leaders organization, they wanted to control the new organization. They wanted to guarantee that leaders were in charge of that. The National Society of State Legislators wanted, they were all for that. It didn't have any problem with leaders being in charge, but they didn't want it at the expense of them having a strong involvement. And legislative staff were the same way. Yeah, we're happy to let leaders run this thing, but we need to have our own activities and control them. And there were a variety of ways where this was worked out. The most symbolic one would be governance. So when they created the new NCSL, there were, the executive committee consisted of 30 members, 20 of whom were legislators, and there was a requirement that at least 10 of the 20 legislators had to be leaders. And then there were also 10 staff on the executive committee, so there was a 2-to-1 ratio of legislators to legislative staff. And legislative staff had their own, thank you, Eric, had their own officer positions, what today we call the staff chair and the staff vice chair. And the staff was allowed to run their own affairs, basically. The second item I want to mention is the voting procedures. And this was an echo of the great compromise of the US Constitution, in which the National Conference of State Legislative Leaders had a proportional voting system. This is for voting on public policy positions for the organization in relation to what was going on in Washington. And so each state got a vote based on the size of their congressional delegation. Obviously, that favored the large states. NLC, the National Legislative Conference, on the other hand, had 1 vote per state with a simple majority required to pass policy positions. And obviously that favored the small states. Well, the compromise that was worked out eventually was that it would be 1 vote per state, but a 3/4 majority to pass the policy position. So a really high consensus bar, and that just happens to be the same proportion that is required for the states to approve an amendment to the US Constitution. So, you know, that if you wonder why things are the way they are at business meetings today, it goes back to 50 years ago. Another probably the most complicated area that I'm just going to gloss over quickly was funding. How are you going to fund this new organization? The desire was to have a new organization that was merged and was stronger and that was substantially bigger than the three organizations just combined. So the Leaders Conference had a budget of about $180,000. They had appropriations from the states that they got from 47 states, but they were just $1,000. So fairly token kind of contributions from the states. The society also asked for $1,000 from the states, but they only had about 15 states that contributed. Instead, they asked individual legislators to pay dues to belong to the organization. And then the National Legislative Conference, the biggest one, their budget was very complicated because it was part of the Council of State Governments. They didn't have an independent budget, which, by the way, in those days was the same for the National Governors Conference, what it was called before it became the National Governors Association. And so the Council of State Governments appropriations totaled about $1.5 million, and the range of it was maybe $15,000 or $20,000 from the smallest states to $100,000 or so for the largest states. Now, the Council of State Governments was threatened by all this talk about merger, and they were afraid of losing their major constituencies, in part because the governors at the very same time in 1974, they were in the process of splitting themselves out from the Council of State Governments. So CSG was very resistant initially, and but eventually they had to give in large part because their board was made up of legislators and governors, and the legislators on the CSG board were sympathetic to the idea of merger, and the governors who were on the CSG board wanted the NGA part splitting off to work as well. So as it ended up, the Council of State Governments had a surplus at the time, and they made a grant that funded the first 6 months of NCSL, the new organization, with a grant of $450,000, which gave NCSL time then to go out to get funding from the states. And then the last issue I'll mention here, and I was told by people I've interviewed about this period of time, there aren't many of us left from that time period, and several people told me that who would lead the organization was going to be a real sticking point because of the egos of those folks. And as it turned out that was pretty simple. The three leaders of the organizations in the fall of 1974 sat down together and they made a deal. Kevin Harrington, the president of the Massachusetts Senate, who was also president of the Leaders Conference at the time, he really wanted to be the first president. And he was willing to give up having a short term. It would be January 1, 1975 to October of 1975. And he was a Democrat, and the rules were Democrat and Republican had to alternate, as it is today. And so the leader of the National Society of State Legislators was a Republican, Tom Jensen from Tennessee, the House Minority Leader. So he naturally went second, And then Martin Sabo, who you saw in that video, in the Minnesota video, who was Speaker of the House in Minnesota, was president of NLC, and he was willing to wait 2 years to be president. So that was pretty easy to do. Actually, on the staff side, there was a compromise as well. Gene Farnham, the House fiscal officer from Michigan, had already had a full year as staff chair of the National Legislative Conference, but kind of like Kevin Harrington, he really wanted to be the first staff chair of the new organization. And Bonnie Reese from Wisconsin, Bob Lang's good friend, sitting here. Bonnie, the Legislative Council Director in Wisconsin, gave in and said she was willing to wait for a year. So everybody worked all of those things out, and gradually all of the issues were resolved, and the scene was set for the merger to take place in Albuquerque.
Thanks, Carl. It seems like the stage is set perfectly for a big meeting to happen, whereby lots of decisions will get made. Am I right?
Yep. And maybe you're wondering about why it's in Albuquerque.
I was curious about why it's in Albuquerque. Anybody else? Thank you, Eric. I appreciate that.
So it's such a great question that I've prepared a video about this, and I have to explain the background on this. You know, I'm a longtime NCSL staffer, and I've been retired for 10 years, but I've still kind of got that always on duty instinct. And so when I got a call from my editors at NCSL while I was on vacation on Cape Cod just a few days ago, saying, we need some changes in that video, I said, okay. And the only place I had to record it was my hotel room. So that's the scene. So am I just going to be able to... How the formation of NCSL took place in Albuquerque in 1974 begins 4 years earlier with one of NCSL's predecessor organizations, the National Legislative Conference. Between the 1970 and 1972 annual meetings of NLC, the organization had 4 different executive directors. One of the 4 was a promising, bright young fellow named Ed Crane, but his political skills were untested. Not long after Crane was hired, he and the president of NLC, Representative John Connolly of Illinois, had an argument that ended with Crane telling Connolly to go stuff yourself, except that stuff was not the verb he used. That director was summarily dismissed. Finally, in 1972, NLC hired the 4th chief executive, Earl Mackey, a former Missouri state legislator who had been serving as director of state-federal relations for NLC. A few weeks later, Earl hired me, a newly minted PhD in political science, as assistant director. One of my primary assignments was managing NLC's annual meetings. Sometime in 1971, California Assembly member Carlos B. had invited NLC to hold its 1974 meeting in San Francisco. The turnover of NLC staff explains why no one made a site visit to confirm the viability of the invitation before the executive committee accepted it. When Earl and I initiated discussions with the California legislative leadership about the 1974 meeting, we discovered, to our dismay, that no one at the Capitol in Sacramento, besides Assembly Member B, knew anything about the plan to hold the NLC meeting in San Francisco. The California leadership eventually said no to hosting the meeting, and we were forced to seek a new site for a 2,000-person meeting that was less than a year away. Wanting to keep the meeting in the West, we checked the availability of hotel and meeting space in the large Western cities. No luck. Nothing was available on such short notice. Earl said, what about Albuquerque? Sure enough, Albuquerque, a city of about 400,000 at the time, had mostly adequate hotel and motel space available, and the Chamber of Commerce promised that a new convention center that was under construction would be completed in time for an August 1974 meeting. The New Mexico legislature was enthusiastic about hosting the meeting. Earl made a hurried site visit to check the city out and decided that even though it would stretch Albuquerque's resources to host the event, it could work. Besides, we had no other choices at that point. As the negotiations for a merger of the three organizations of state legislatures advanced in late 1973, it soon became the goal for all the groups to meet jointly and approve the merger at the NLC annual meeting in Albuquerque. That's the story behind how Albuquerque became a code word among insiders for the culmination of the merger of three previously competing legislative organizations that formed the new National Conference of State Legislatures. Thank you. So if I can invite Tim and Natalie up here. So in the annals of NCSL staff, there are lots of memorable stories about annual meetings, now known as legislative summits. One of the craziest occurred at the Albuquerque meeting, and we're going to reenact it for you today.
Okay, I gotta throw it.
Now, a word to the wise. This requires a lot of imagination on your part.
There you go. That's sufficient.
So, have you got the flipper?
I do.
Part of your imagination is that we're better prepared. So, I'm going to set the scene for you. It's the state dinner at the National Legislative Conference annual meeting in Albuquerque in 1974. In those days, the tradition at National Association meetings was to hold formal banquets, known as state dinners, where members of the board and their spouses, dressed in black tie and evening gowns, sat at head tables.
Do I have a line?
No, you're good.
Oh.
Like this one.
Oh.
Except imagine that it was 2 or 3 times the size because it had to accommodate 40 or 50 people. And this event takes place on August 17, 1974. What was going on that week? The resignation of Richard Nixon. A dramatic event in American history. Now, let me introduce you to, seated at the head table, Earl Roselle, the strapping rancher husband of Montana State Senator Tony Roselle. Tony Roselle was a member of the executive committee, and they were sitting on the lower tier of our imaginary head table. So you also must imagine that that glass that's in front of her doesn't hold water, it holds red wine. And so that's supposed to...
Just like the first meeting.
Okay, so yeah, imagine that's the red wine. And now, please join me in welcoming our major speaker for the evening, James J. Kilpatrick, the distinguished American newspaper journalist and writer of the nationally syndicated column, The Conservative View. So here he is in his white dinner jacket, and he's in the middle of his speech, which naturally features Richard Nixon.
So how do we explain Richard Nixon? Let me turn to Shakespeare. Nixon's always had Shakespearean qualities, if you ask me. Because of the first name, perhaps, it's always tempting to liken him to Richard III. But that's not really a perfect fit. I can think of all kinds of ways to compare him to other Shakespearean tragic heroes. Hamlet, Othello, or Macbeth. But for me, Nixon is King Lear.
Nonsense! It was the press that did Nixon in. You scoundrels are all alike.
That's horse shit. As I was saying before, Lear and Nixon experienced dramatic and public falls from power. That's how it goes.
So that bit of drama at the state dinner put a punctuation mark on the day that NCSL, the bipartisan voice of the states, was born.
Thank you.
So, thank you to our marvelous actors. There's a member of the audience here who was on the NLC staff at the time. Joe Mullen was director of training, and he's got another story about Albuquerque.
Happy to be here. I'm Joe Mullen, live 20 miles away, and my wife said to me, "Where are you going today?" I said, I worked with Kyle Kurtz 50 years ago. I'm 78 years old, and going down to Kyle to talk about Albuquerque. And she said, "Well, when you go down there, the good news for you is you don't look a day over 77. So we worked together real well. Albuquerque, we had really some last-minute individuals coming in from the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House. And one call came in from newly elected Senator Joe Biden from Delaware. He was coming out in 1974. He had been elected in 72, and he had you all know, I'm sure, quite a tragedy with his first 8 months in the Senate, where he lost his wife and his daughter in a horrible accident. So he said he was coming out to Albuquerque, but he wanted somebody who would take him to daily mass. Well, Earl Mackey said to me, "Joe, I remember, I think you're a Catholic." I said, "Earl, I was an altar boy for 7 years.
Try to be really short with it.
You're the one who's taking Joe to mass. Take the afternoon off, go around Albuquerque, find a church, and when Joe comes in, you can take him to church." I drove around Albuquerque, found a nice Hispanic-looking Catholic church, and noted that the masses began at 6:45, 9 a.m., and 11 a.m. So I'm guessing that Senator Biden wants to go to the 11 a.m. mass. He comes downstairs, and I said, "Senator, what mass do you want to go to?" 6:45 a.m. Good. Off we go to mass, and again, I am an altar boy of long standing, so we're sitting there at 6:45 a.m. It's the first mass on Sunday. Lo and behold, Senator Biden and I are the only ones sitting in the church, and the priest is undertaking to say mass. Now, as an old altar boy, one of the key things that I always wondered about and cared about was that at every mass, you always had the basket being passed to see how much people would put in for the daily collection. And I was really, really very much hoping that at this particular mass, I would see what Senator Biden put into the collection box. And in all my years, it's the only Catholic mass that they decided not to pass the collection box. In any case, the summary of that is, after that, I followed his career. I was 32, 33, he was 30 at the time, and I watched his progress, and I can say to all of you here today that here, sitting among you, is somebody who, 20 years from now, will be President of the United States. And the other thing that I can guarantee is that if you are President at that time, Kyle Kurtz and I will be there 20 years from now and make sure to cheer you on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks for that nice through line between Albuquerque and here in Boston. Carl, as we start to wrap up the session, talk to us about why the merger occurred then. Like, what was so special about that time? You talked a little bit about the legislative evolution.
Yeah, so we've already talked about the legislative strengthening movement and the changes in federalism. Those were definitely driving forces. And as we talked about federalism, I didn't talk about the really strong desire. It was a driving force at the time for more influence for state legislatures in Washington. and that was the principal goal at the time, much more so, I think, than today. But one thing I just want to highlight really briefly was that it was a case of the right leaders coming together at the right time. And three leaders in particular I want to mention pretty briefly were on the left, Speaker Herb Feynman of Pennsylvania and Speaker Bill Ratchford of Connecticut. Both of them were actually kind of took on the name of the father of the modern legislature in their state. They were the ones who had steered their legislature through this process. And Chuck Kerfess from Ohio was just determined to make this occur. He was the tactician. He got himself placed on the boards of the Leaders Conference, ran for president of NLC, sat on the CSG board, and he was also the best draftsman. All three of these guys were attorneys, and Kerfess was the best draftsman, and so he was the lead writer of the Constitution of the new organization. Feynman was he was a blunt, tough, partisan guy, and he was kind of the enforcer. And whenever, especially with CSG, he was the one who could be blunt, whereas Ratchford and Kerfess came out of NLC and had to compromise with them a lot. And then just three other people I'll mention really briefly who had a key role in that were, they weren't all that involved in the merger talks, but in the last 6 months, they were very involved. Tom Jensen from Tennessee, who was a very savvy politician and kind of had a compromising and ability to bring people together. And two staff people, George McManus, the House Fiscal Director in Pennsylvania, and from Tennessee, Bill Snodgrass, who was the Comptroller of the Treasury there, a legislative elected position in Tennessee, and they really stood up for the staff and the staff rights. So I'm going to cut that short.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I mean, you mentioned the importance of meeting the moment, having great leaders who can all come together, and we have a bunch of great leaders in this room. So it would be amiss if we didn't ask you all. As you sit through and you reflected on the past and you watched a little skit and you saw some videos and hopefully you got in that 1970s place, what are some lessons that you think state legislatures today can learn from that era or that time? Whether you were around then or you're a student of state legislatures like Carl and I are. Oh, what a surprise. John Turcotte's going to say something. And we encourage others to stand up as well.
I was amazed that no one has said anything about he was a Democrat, he was a Republican, he was an ultra-conservative Republican, he was an ultra-liberal Democrat, and we had to resolve all those partisan differences, and there was lots of rancor about that on the scene, behind the scenes. The only indication of that, I think, was when Natalie threw the wine on the fellow. But I just wonder if we could do that today, if we could have an organization, several organizations now, let's just skip forward and say that hadn't happened. We didn't have NCSL. Could we form NCSL today in today's political environment? I kind of have my doubts about that. I would like to be optimistic, but it would take a tremendous effort, and I just want to mention that and ask if anybody has any insights on that. Would it be possible, and how could we do that? Because something was working back then. I mean, you can see these leaders that they've put on the screen here. All of them were I think, their interests were more functional, like leaders, staff, and how much connection we have with other organizations that represent the governors and so forth. But I just wonder if it would be at all possible today. I have my doubts.
Well, I welcome others to respond. I think it would be a lot more difficult, but I'm not going to speculate in any detail about that. Anybody else have reactions to that or anything else you want to ask about?
No?
So in the back is George Roberts, I think the senior person who's here. He was Speaker of the House in New Hampshire and 6th president of NCSL in 1979, 1980.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to speak. We have a quorum count, and we have limited time, less than 3 minutes. First of all, if NCSL had not merged, we would have been in a position where the states would not have any real voice in Congress. One of the great things, or 3 things I think NCSL did, it asked speakers to send people from both parties to their conferences, summits, and seminars, which were everything from computer science to energy, health, back and forth on every issue, almost all the places in the country where most legislators enjoyed going. I personally took an attitude that while there could have been a proportion count, that if people on either side wanted to go, we were limited by number. So I asked other speakers at the time to do the same thing, because the more people you got going, these legislators, you get a great educational process going during their legislative term. And I've seen people not just change their attitudes on policy, but change their attitude on how they respond to others. After the last meeting we went to, where things are very narrow and curse and arrogant, there was a difference because people did get together. So I believe that the National Conference of State Legislatures is a great way to get people who have difference of opinion in political party lines, but also in philosophy. And the other thing about NCSL, part of the push behind it, we were in that Kellogg study too, was that they had a checklist, and it was almost embarrassing not to have staff. It's embarrassing not to have certain rules, and embarrassing not to use Masons. So leaders, when they talk to each other, they sort of gauge how you're doing. They saw a tremendous movement during that early period. The other thing that drove, I think, NCSL's emergence is that they said, we need not only a voice in Congress, we need a strong position in Washington so we can bring our legislators to Washington to lobby our the United States senators and House members. And then that, I think, was a great contribution to NCSL and the emergence of stronger legislators. We didn't like mandates. We didn't like non-funded programs. We had a chance to talk, and sometimes we succeeded. And Cal, I want to thank you, and of course the great Earl Mackey, for being 2 of the leaders of the staff of NCSL. You've done a great job. You're still doing one. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you so
Mr.
much,
Speaker.
Mr. Speaker. Tie in what the speaker from New Hampshire just shared, and John, what you said. I am an optimist, so I feel so grateful for the opportunities I get through NCSL to see bipartisanship in action. When people ask me, how can you do the work that you do? I mentioned I've been here 20 years. I left NCSL and came back because it is such a powerful place to work as a staffer. And so the ability to watch our members at meetings like this, that gets me going because the dialogue is great, the friendships are real. I was very moved by our opening session today. I don't know if you were too. We track the bipartisan nature of legislation. Admittedly, it's a loose methodology to track that, but we tell folks who ask questions about that 80%, over 80% of legislation that's passed in state legislatures is bipartisan when you look at the vote counts. So I feel proud that we stand as a place where those convenings happen. Whether it could form now, that is a question to ponder. but I'm proud to say that we're in existence and it's strong. I'm stealing Tim's thunder because he had to leave, but it's the largest gathering of state legislators and legislative staff that we've had. Our numbers are that good this year, so I don't know.
So
We're in
that's
good
what
health.
that's what we said in Albuquerque, and the number we had 2,300 total people, and it was at that point the largest gathering ever of state legislators and state legislative staff.
Well, I think that full circle moment's probably a pretty good place to end, unless anyone has something for the good of the order before we conclude. Will the clerks close the roll? Oh, Max has got something. Hang on, Max, we got a mic coming for you.
Got to have a microphone. I think we already have an answer to what we need to do. If you look to the Legislative Staff Coordinating Committee, LSCC, that's about as diverse a group as you can get when it comes to all of us who are trying to be supporters of the legislature. And what they do in their committees is they listen first to understand, not to refute. That's just part of what they do. And they're so good at it, I think it's kind of a magic group. They listen to understand first, not to refute.
Thank you, Max. Well said. Well, with that, we're going to conclude our presentation today. Thanks again for being here at Boston, being here at this session, and we'll see you soon.